Picture this. I'm standing there in my driveway, breath pluming in the freezing Naperville air, clutching a $50 citation for excessive holiday luminance, looking at three simple strings of lights that my late wife picked out, while the president of our homeowners association smirks at me and tells me my grief is lowering property values. That was my first mistake, standing there and taking it, because I should have gotten angry right then and there. But instead, I just smiled, a tight, polite, broken little smile, having no idea that 6 months later, that same woman would be literally on her knees in front of 47 neighbors, begging me to shut off the most spectacular light show Oakhaven Reserve had ever seen. Lasers painting her financial crimes across the community center walls while news cameras rolled and police officers took notes. The crisp December air carried the scent of pine needles and impending snow as Patty Caldwell's heels clicked away from my door that first morning. The sound like a ticking clock counting down to her own destruction, and she thought she'd won. Poor Patty had absolutely no idea. She had just declared war on a widowed electrical engineer with nothing left to lose and a very specific set of skills. What would you do if a petty tyrant attacked the last physical connection you had to a deceased spouse? Would you fold, or would you burn their little kingdom to the ground using their own rulebook as kindling? Let me introduce myself. I'm Arthur Artie Vance, 47 years old, a systems engineer who spent 20 years optimizing power grids, and as of 2 years ago, a widower who thought he'd found a quiet place to heal in Oakhaven Reserve, a neighborhood we moved to specifically for Eleanor's health, because the doctors at Northwestern Memorial said the stress of the city was too much and she needed trees, silence, and peace. Eleanor had this obsession with Christmas lights that bordered on the magical. Every November she'd spread graph paper across our kitchen table, sketching holiday displays like she was designing the architecture of heaven itself, debating warm white versus cool white with the intensity of a senator filibustering a bill. And when she passed on a rainy Tuesday in March, I kept those lights up until Easter because taking them down felt like admitting she was really gone, like erasing her signature from the world. So when December rolled around again, the first Christmas without her, I put up the same 3 modest strings, nothing fancy, just her final gift to the neighborhood, a warm glow that reminded me of her laugh and the way she'd stand in our doorway with hot cocoa, admiring her handiwork, which is exactly when I met Patty Caldwell. You have to picture a woman who probably irons her socks and organizes her pantry by the Dewey Decimal System. Patty had ruled the Reserve Association for 8 years like a suburban dictator, complete with the paranoia and the power trips, married to Richard Caldwell, a real estate developer who'd built half the subdivision and wore his arrogance like a cheap cologne. Patty had a gift for targeting anyone who didn't fit her vision of the perfect aesthetic. Poor Mr. Santos got slammed with fines for a bird feeder because apparently cardinals were flying rats, and the Miller family got cited because their 5-year-old sidewalk chalk was considered unauthorized street graffiti. But the kicker, the absolute cherry on top of this hypocrisy sundae, was that Patty's own fence was 6 inches higher than regulations allow, and she ran a garage-based business, selling macrame plant holders that looked like depressed spiderwebs, a clear violation of the No Home Businesses Clause. The morning she delivered my notice, I was brewing coffee, the rich aroma of a dark roast filling the empty house. Watching her approach through the window, clipboard clutched like a weapon, and at 7 a.m. sharp she announced that my display violated community standards, saying, "We can't have the neighborhood looking like a trailer park." A phrase that hit me like a physical slap because these were Eleanor's lights, Eleanor's design. I took the paper, the texture rough against my trembling fingers, and promised to take them down by January 2nd, playing the part of the obedient sheep. But as she walked away, I realized she wasn't just attacking lights, she was attacking my memory of my wife, and I wasn't about to let some power-drunk suburban queen disrespect Eleanor. I took them down on January 3rd, freezing my hands off, carefully coiling each strand the way Eleanor used to, securing them with twist ties, storing them in labeled boxes in my garage with the door open because the grief was a heavy weight in my chest, and I needed the fresh air, which turned out to be a fatal error because 3 days later Patty was back, this time with a spineless guy from the architectural committee who looked like he'd rather be getting a root canal. She handed me another fine, $75 this time, for improper storage practices because my garage door had been opened during storage activities and the boxes were visible from the street. citing Ordinance 47B. And that was the moment the sadness in my gut crystallized into a cold, hard rage. That night, I did what any reasonable engineer does when attacked by bureaucratic nonsense. I went to war with research, spreading the HOA bylaws across my kitchen table like battle plans, armed with caffeine and the kind of focus that builds skyscrapers. And 3 hours later I struck gold. Absolute, distinct legal gold. It turned out the Reserve Association hadn't filed their required annual reports with the Illinois Secretary of State in 3 years, which isn't just sloppy, it's potentially illegal, meaning they technically lost their legal standing to enforce rules. But I didn't stop there. I spent the next week playing amateur private investigator, walking the neighborhood with a tape measure and a camera, documenting that Patty's fence was indeed too high, documenting the commercial traffic for her craft business, and documenting her husband's commercial work truck parked in their driveway every weekend for 2 years in violation of the no commercial vehicles rule. I filed formal complaints against all 3 violations, delivered personally to the board, and 2 days later I got a call from Mrs. Higgins, the elderly woman 3 houses down who used to be a paralegal, her voice shaky but excited as she told me, "Arthur, dear, you need to know something. Patty called an emergency board meeting last night. They're trying to change the storage rules retroactively to make your violations stick." Word began to spread. Mr. Santos stopped by with homemade empanadas and war stories about his bird feeder. The Millers brought cookies and photos of the chalk art violation. And we started meeting for coffee at my place, a support group for the bullied. And that's when I realized that Patty's authority was built entirely on fear and isolation. But take that away, and she was just a bully with a clipboard. The emergency meeting was an ambush. Patty planned to ram through new rules and increase my fine to $150, threatening a lien on my property. But when I walked into that community center, I didn't come alone. I brought a briefcase full of evidence and a room full of neighbors who had suddenly found their voices, the air smelling of industrial cleaner and nervous sweat. When she tried to lecture me, I stood up and said, "Actually, I think we need to discuss your failure to file state-required financial reports for the past 3 years." And the silence that followed was so complete you could hear the fluorescent lights humming, Patty's face cycling through colors like a broken traffic light. 2 weeks after my document dump, Patty escalated to what I can only call the nuclear option, hiring a professional community management company to handle the Reserve Association affairs, which turned out to be a company called Prestige Community Management, owned by her brother-in-law, a guy named Rick who drove a lifted truck and thought management meant extortion. The new fees hit us like a sledgehammer, a $200 monthly assessment for all residents plus 6 months of retroactive billing, meaning I suddenly owed $1,200 immediately or faced accelerated collection procedures. The notice printed on letterhead that looked like it was designed by a toddler in Microsoft Paint. I dug into state licensing records and, surprise, surprise, Prestige wasn't properly licensed to manage HOA accounts in Illinois. So I filed a complaint with the Attorney General. But the real rebellion started when I organized an emergency residents meeting at the community park, far away from Patty's prying eyes. 23 of the 47 residents showed up, huddled in coats as the wind whipped around us. Mrs. Higgins passing out a thermos of coffee strong enough to wake the dead, and I revealed what I'd found in the deep financial records. Patty's husband's company, Caldwell Development Group, owed nearly $50,000 in unpaid HOA fees for the spec homes he'd built, yet he was getting no-bid contracts for emergency repairs every few months. It was a classic conflict of interest, a grift so transparent it was insulting, and the meeting felt like a revival service, neighbors sharing horror stories, pooling resources for a real lawyer, forcing Patty to hire her own legal counsel, a sharp woman named Ms. Sterling who charged more per hour than I made in a week, which meant Patty now had to follow actual legal procedures, effectively tying her own hands with red tape. The harassment intensified. Patty started doing daily inspection patrols at 8 a.m., photographing my mailbox, measuring my grass with a ruler, practically crawling on the sidewalk to find cracks, issuing fines for excessive window condensation. And one morning my security cameras captured pure gold. Patty Caldwell, pillar of the community, crouching by my driveway at dawn, muttering to herself while measuring the distance between my tire and the curb. I uploaded the footage to our neighborhood Facebook group with the caption, "When HOA enforcement goes too far." And within hours it went viral, catching the eye of Veronica Hayes from WGN News, who came out and did a segment where I explained how a dispute over a dead woman's Christmas lights had spiraled into tyranny. The segment generated 50,000 views. Donations poured into a legal fund Mrs. Higgins set up, and suddenly Patty's little kingdom was under scrutiny from the city council and the state. But instead of backing down, she doubled down, filing a restraining order against me, which the judge threw out immediately, calling it frivolous. But the real turning point, the moment the ground truly shifted, came when Mrs. Higgins called me on a Friday morning, her voice trembling with the kind of excitement usually reserved for winning the lottery, telling me to get over to the community center storage room immediately. I found her surrounded by dusty boxes from the late 80s, holding a manila folder like it was the Holy Grail, pointing to paragraph 17, subsection C of the original covenants, highlighted in yellow, a sunset clause stating the HOA automatically dissolves after 35 years unless 75% of residents vote to renew it. I did the math, my heart hammering against my ribs. 35 years from 1989 meant the HOA was set to dissolve on March 15th, exactly 3 weeks away. Mrs. Higgins pulled out more papers, showing that renewal notices should have been sent 6 months ago, but Patty had buried them, scheduling the renewal vote for an obscure Wednesday morning and only informing her 12 loyalists, even forging signatures on the preliminary paperwork because she knew she couldn't get the votes legitimately. The realization hit me like a freight train. Patty had been operating a shadow government, hiding the expiration date to keep the gravy train running for her husband's failing business. And if we did nothing, the HOA would vanish, which sounded great until I realized that meant no snow removal, no pool maintenance, and property values plummeting for my innocent neighbors. I held the nuclear option. I could let it burn, but this wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about justice and rebuilding. So I turned my living room into mission control for Operation Illumination. We had 21 days, 15 neighbors crowded around my coffee table, Mrs. Higgins handling legal strategy, the Millers handling social media, and me. Well, I called in favors from my old colleagues at a lighting design firm in Chicago, obtaining professional-grade laser projectors that we disguised as standard audiovisual equipment. My plan was simple but devastating. Hijack the annual meeting's presentation to display the truth on a scale Patty couldn't ignore, synchronized charts and evidence projected onto the walls, a light show that would make her financial crimes the brightest thing in the room. Patty was panicking, moving the meeting date up to March 8th, trying to bribe me with a $10,000 consulting fee to drop my opposition, which I recorded, thank you Illinois one-party consent laws, and even staging a fake vandalism attack on her own home, breaking her own window, which the police saw right through because my neighbor's camera caught her doing it. She was a cornered animal, desperate and dangerous. Attacking Eleanor's memory with anonymous flyers claiming grief had made me mentally unstable, which only united the neighborhood behind me even more. The night before the meeting, we tested the lasers remotely from Mrs. Higgins' house, the projectors humming in the community center ceiling where my repairman friends had installed them during routine maintenance, ready to paint the walls with the truth. Mrs. Higgins found the final smoking gun. Patty had embezzled over $80,000 directly into personal accounts. We were ready. The trap was set. March 8th arrived with a sky the color of bruised iron, the air thick with tension as residents filed into the community center, packing the room tighter than a rush-hour train car. 43 of the 47 homeowners crammed into folding chairs that groaned under the weight of the moment. Veronica Hayes and her WGN camera crew were set up in the back, blending in but ready, and in the front row sat an investigator from the state attorney general's office, looking calm and lethal with his notepad, while Councilwoman Baker watched like a hawk. The smell of nervous sweat and cheap coffee permeated the room as Patty called the meeting to order, her hands shaking as she gripped the gavel, her usual pearls looking more like a noose around her neck as she tried to rush through a motion to renew the charter without a financial report. I move that we vote immediately, she stammered, ignoring the sea of hostile faces, but I stood up, adrenaline flooding my system, briefcase in hand, and said, "Point of order. State law requires a complete financial report before any renewal vote." And when she tried to shut me down, the Attorney General's investigator stood up and said, "I'd like to hear that report too." It's relevant to our ongoing fraud investigation. The silence was deafening, the kind of silence that happens right before a bomb goes off. And that's when I pulled out my smartphone and hit execute. The house lights dimmed, not by her command, but by mine. And suddenly the walls of the community center erupted in light, professional-grade lasers cutting through the darkness to project 3 years of financial rot in brilliant, high-definition color. Charts showing $87,000 in misappropriated funds, payments to Prestige Management, unauthorized transfers to Caldwell Development. Every theft highlighted in accusatory crimson. "You said my holiday lights were excessive, Patty." I called out, my voice steady over the collective gasp of the room. "How's this for a light show?" The climax came when Mrs. Higgins stood up, holding the 1989 covenants like a sword, and the lasers shifted to write this sunset clause in 3-foot-tall letters across the ceiling, revealing the forged signatures she had prepared. Patty tried to scream that it was all fake, clutching the microphone like a lifeline, but the lasers spelled out, "Truth illuminates darkness," across the wall behind her, turning the room into a cathedral of accountability. And as the cameras flashed, she dropped the gavel and literally ran for the exit, abandoning 8 years of tyranny in a sprint to her car. The police stepped in to secure the records. The investigator began taking statements, and the room exploded into cheers, neighbors hugging, crying, the relief palpable as the weight of her oppression lifted. 1 week later, we held a real election, and I won the presidency in a landslide, 43 votes to 2, with Mrs. Higgins taking over as treasurer to clean up the mess. We slashed fees by 60%, refunded the bogus fines, and I took my settlement from the embezzlement recovery, a sum that would make you weep, and donated half to establish the Eleanor Vance Engineering Scholarship at the local high school, and the other half went to the most insane, beautiful holiday light display Naperville has ever seen. We launched the Light Up Oak Haven Festival that December, a synchronized laser and LED spectacular that draws people from 3 counties, raising money for Lurie Children's Hospital, where Eleanor spent her final days. Patty and Richard sold their house at a loss and fled the state before the indictments dropped. And every year, when I stand on my lawn watching the lights dance in time to the music, visible from where Patty's bedroom window used to be, I feel Eleanor beside me, knowing that sometimes you have to burn the corruption down to build something warm in its place. I even started seeing Susan, Mrs. Higgins' daughter, a nurse with a backbone of steel, and life moved forward. But here's the question that keeps me up at night, the thing I want you to argue about in the comments. I could have let the HOA dissolve. I could have let the neighborhood devolve into chaos just to punish Patty, but I chose to save the institution to save my neighbors. Was that mercy? Or was that just another form of control? Did I do the right thing by rebuilding the system that oppressed us? Or should I have let it die? Drop your city in the comments. Tell me your HOA horror stories. And remember, documentation defeats evil every single time, especially when you have lasers.
Alright, and that is for today's videos. I hope you enjoyed it and found something useful. If you did, don't forget to like, subscribe and share it with your friends. Let me know your thoughts in the comment below. And thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.